So this is actually one of my favorite talks to give. The last day or so, I've kind of touched on hydration a little bit, and I kept on saying, I'm going to talk to you about that on Saturday. I'm going to talk to you about that on Saturday. This is that talk. This, and then this afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about energy balance, which if you were at yesterday's talk about the whole beating the metabolic code, remember I was talking about how the most important factor for you to manage during a ride, to have a good ride, is going to be hydration. These are the details of that hydration. The last at the bottom, what was the very third factor to deal with in having a good ride? Energy balance. That's the one we're going to talk about this afternoon, because not so much that there's definitely ways to go ahead and increase your horse's energy throughout a ride, especially if you're planning on going for placing or doing multi-days, whatever you're doing. But mostly it's going to talk about how to avoid having your horse bonk during the day. A lot of those topics that we talked yesterday, but we're going to talk about it in more detail and about how to get there, and some of the micromanaging, and definitely a lot of tips and tricks about different slides. Here we go. So what are we going to talk about? What are the tolerable versus the intolerable levels of dehydration and what happens at each of those levels? Their specific effect on performance and health. A lot of the misconceptions, especially about the way that you manage your horse's thirst during trailering, during the ride, after the ride, and some ways that you can get around that, and a lot of sort of myths about, well, this is how human thirst works, therefore it must work the same way in humans, and I know you're interested in that, Dave. How to manipulate the thirst response, some ways that you can trick them, and just a little odds and ends and tips and tricks, just little tiny bits of things that I've pulled out of different research studies. We're talking about dehydration. We measure that in percentage, and that's because even a really experienced ride vet, we don't even start to see any indications of changes in hydration until those horses are at least 5% or more dehydrated. Even with looking at the percentage, that's going to be an estimate. We can look at a horse and go, okay, I'm going to say this horse is 5 to 6% dehydrated, maybe 7 to 8. 10%, that starts to become a little obvious. 12% is easy because they're usually on the floor and shocking and trying to die. Generally, you're really lucky if you go to a ride where they have a weight scale. And if you do have rides where they have something like that, absolutely, positively take advantage of that. Weigh your horse multiple times. When you arrive at base camp, after he's been there for a couple of hours, after you checked in the next morning before the start, at lunch if they've got it available after that, it will give you scads of really valuable information about how your horse's hydration status is doing. Have these exact numbers, and this is even with blood work. You cannot pull a full panel on a horse. There is nothing that I can look at and go, one parameter says, oh, look at that. It tells me that your horse is 6% dehydrated. We can see some comparative changes where things are starting to concentrate and change, but there is no blood panel that is going to tell me your horse is 5% dehydrated. This is why during a vet check, we have so many different parameters that are all trying to give us another statistical data point about how hydrated your horse is. Looking at the gums, looking at capillary refill time, seeing how juicy those gums are, looking at the skin pinch, what they call jug fill, where we pinch, we kind of put our finger against the bottom of the jugular vein. We want to see how quickly that blood column fills up. Listening to heart rate and recovery. That's why we want to know, how long has this horse been in? How long did it take you to come back to recovery? I want to listen to gut sounds, because poor gut sounds are almost, at least in an endurance ride, are always going to be related to hydration. Analysis, yeah, there's some things I can look at, but none of them are going to be objective numbers. They are just going to tell me other things, including important stuff like how are your horse's kidneys doing. This means that when we're looking at a conclusion and predictions about hydration, these are always going to be an estimate. They're not an absolute measurement. And that's important for you to know, because none of these are things where you have to have a handheld iStat out on the trail, which you wouldn't be allowed to do anyway unless you're conditioning. But none of these tests are things that you have to have a vet to do. There's no reason why you can't be doing this yourself while you're conditioning, after you come back from a ride, when you come into lunch, when you come into vet check 3, any point during the day, you should already know more than what the vet does. Nothing he says to you should ever come as a surprise. So, when we're talking about 0% dehydrated, we're not dehydrated at all. That is a horse that is fully hydrated. The opposite end of that scale is 12%. That is a horse that is about to die. And almost always that is a horse that has significant damage to their kidneys. If they've gotten in time to a clinic, that's a horse that's going to be there for several days on fluids, and hopefully he's going to leave going out the front door and not out the back door. Horses at vet checks, we see them very often that are 6 to 7% dehydrated, and usually these are the ones that are having problems of some sort. Slow recovery, gut sounds are a little quieter than we would like, mucous membranes are not as juicy as we would like, capillary refill times maybe start to slow down a little bit. These are horses that, kind of looking at the overall picture, maybe this is a horse that the vet might be considering, maybe you need to hang it up and call it for a day. Potentially, this might be a horse that needs some treatment. Certainly, at the end of a ride, there's not a single horse finishing a ride that would not benefit by having 20 liters of fluids dumped into them. And that's one thing in endurance we need to get away from, is the stigma of taking your horse and doing him the favor and conserving your horse's current health and his future health by taking to the treatment vet and going, you know what, he seems to be okay, he's drinking, he's eating, he passed okay, but you know what, it's hot weather and we've got a long trailer ride home tomorrow. Is there any chance that we could just run in 10, 20 gallons of liters of okay, maybe not 20 gallons. Although I've done, I think my personal record for running in IV fluids on a horse was 75 liters. Yeah, it's a misconception. A lot of people will think, well, I'm just doing an intro ride. I'm just doing a limited distance ride. He's going to be fine. The most metabolically compromised, dehydrated, in trouble horse I have ever had to treat. I wasn't even, this wasn't at a competition. This just happened to be at a ranch where I was boarding my horse at the time. It just so happened that was back when I was doing full-time ambulatory equine. I had just stopped off to pick off some tack, and I had to be in my the vet truck. There was a ride and tie group that they were there that weekend for a practice ride. So they had just laid out literally a 10-mile loop. But because it was just a practice loop, there was no water out on this 10-mile loop, because I mean, it's only 10 miles, right? There was no natural water out there. But somebody had brought a horse. She was interested in getting into ride and tie. So she had loaded up her horse the night before so it could practice camping. This was the second time in that horse's life it had ever been in a trailer. First time it had ever been in a trailer alone. The driver was not inexperienced, so she was driving this truck and trailer as though she drove her daily commuter car in heavy traffic in a hurry. So it sounded like this was kind of a baby in a boxcar syndrome. And you could see this horse had some abrasions and scrapes on it and where he'd been scrambling around. Then she gets him out, she parked away, and there weren't that many horses there. He had never spent a night tied to the trailer. She had a small bucket of water on the side of the trailer that looked like a head trap to him, so he didn't drink water all night long, and spent the entire night, and this was in warm weather, spent the entire night digging holes to China and spinning in circles. Goes out for 10 miles and comes back, and this horse was easily 10% dehydrated and literally came in staggering. So, you know, and at that point, the nearest clinic that could have handled that was about over an hour drive down windy roads. So it just so happened that, you know, I was there with the truck, so I went, all right, let's go ahead and let's get started. And I think I dumped 30 liters into that horse before we loaded him up into the trailer, and he was stable enough to take to the clinic where he stayed for the next 3 days. Because at that point also his kidneys had shut down. And, but anyway, the notion here is a lot of people kind of go, oh no, he'll be fine, you know, he hasn't learned to drink yet, but we're only doing 10 miles, we're only doing 25, we're only 30, we're only doing a 1 day 50. Most of the fluid lost during the ride is going to be lost during the first 25 miles, and that's regardless of how experienced your horse is, about 90% of the time, and regardless of how far you're going that day. So, we started talking about this yesterday. The average endurance horse is gonna be 5% dehydrated at the end of 50 to 100 miles. It turns out now that we know that they're about 5% dehydrated at the end of 25 miles. So first 25 miles, and we're gonna talk about why. This is about how long it takes most horses for that thirst response to really start to kick in. So that's gonna be roughly in the area of about 6 gallons of unreplaced fluid loss. Dehydration less than 5%, the best vet on the planet, we cannot look at that horse and even start to identify changes that are indicating hydration loss. But the body knows, and the body is gonna respond to that. So remember that, we talked about this yesterday, the difference between tolerable dehydration, which is about that 5%, and the difference between a horse that needs treatment is only about roughly 3-4 gallons of onboard fluids. Some of those, 2-gallon, the little buckets that we usually use for vet checks. The difference between tolerable and a horse that's about ready to die is less than 8 gallons of onboard fluid losses. Doesn't seem like much for a 1,000-pound animal, does it? How do they get dehydrated in the first place? Well, before the start, there's trailer losses. We know this was from an Australian study, and this was in perfect conditions. These were experienced horses in a professional van that were all, they had buddies, were well tied, it was being driven by a professional driver. Still, nevertheless, this is under ideal circumstances. These horses are losing 0.9 gallons of onboard fluids per hour of travel. 1% dehydrated for every 90 minutes of cumulative travel. And again, this is under perfect conditions. This is going to increase if it's super hot weather, if your horse is not a good traveler, if you happen to be traveling alone, and he's one of those horses that tap dances and sweats and paws and pees and is really unhappy the entire time. For an 8-hour trip, that means on average, these horses are going to be 5% dehydrated as soon as they step off the trailer. And that's roughly about a little over 6 gallons of onboard fluids that they need to ideally try and replace overnight before they start the next day. These are going to be additionally 5% dehydrated just from the ride itself, plus whatever this leftover hydration load is from the traveling the day before. At 2001 Tevis, I collected serial blood panels on a whole bunch of horses, and we found out that 60% of the horses, this is at Tevis, man, the rides don't get much meaner than that. 60% of the horses that we analyzed blood samples started less than fully hydrated. 20% of them started measurably dehydrated, and this was by looking at hemoconcentration, albumin, total proteins. Again, it's kind of an estimate, but we could just say, they give you normal ranges, and you go, okay, not within the normal range, this is the high end of the normal range, this is above, this is wherever. So we can kind of get a qualitative idea. Only 10% of the horses that started Tevis that year started that ride fully hydrated. Those were local horses. Horses that were not having to travel for hours and hours and hours, or sometimes even days. Regardless of whether, if those horses had, okay, we're only going to travel for about 6 hours and we're stopping, we're staying overnight at a really nice place that can stop, relax, hydrate. No, by the time they got to Roby, those horses were still measurably more dehydrated than the horses that only had to travel, say less than 2-3 hours. It is a big mistake thinking that all you have to do is tie your horse to the trailer or put him in his pen or his overhead tie or whatever, put a bucket or a tub of water in front of him, and he's going to go ahead and rehydrate overnight. Not necessarily, probably not. Horses can or will only replace about 2/3 of their deficit by drinking during the ride, and this also includes overnight. So all the time I come across riders that go, yeah, I don't worry about it if he's not drinking until X number of miles or whatever. As soon as he's thirsty, he'll drink what he needs. No, they don't. If you had decided today's the day, you're gonna go out for a 10-mile run yourself, and it's hot weather and you're not used to it and you're not carrying any fluids along with you, and you come on back and you're really dehydrated, then you go ahead and you start drinking. You may be down, the equivalent of 4 or 5 20-ounce bottles of water. Are you gonna pound all of those down at the same time? No, because your stomach capacity is not going to be able to handle it. Same thing with horses. Even if they are very, very thirsty, they are not going to completely replace that fluid deficit all the time, all at the same time. So it's a very dangerous notion, and it's a mistake to think and assume my horse will just drink what he needs. And this is even no matter how experienced your horse is, because this is not necessarily just an experience thing, this is a physiology thing. Now happily, as horses get experience, they do tend to drink better and earlier, but you can't say that that horse is gonna hydrate himself sufficiently just by giving him, offering water. On top of just not having enough stomach capacity and only wanting to do that 2/3, we're gonna talk about a little bit more about that in a second. Contributing factors are inexperience. Horses that are there being tourists, they still don't really know their job. They're so busy looking at their buddy over there, look, there's some more horses coming in here, or that horse just went, off that way and I wanna go see what that is, or look, there's a squirrel in a tree. Well, usually it's me going, look, there's a squirrel in a tree. Whatever it is, just the excitement of being at the ride. And this can also be, just experienced horses that are just, hot shoes and, they want to get on down the trail. No, I don't have the time, I don't want to drink, I want to go chase those other horses that are on the hunt. Unfamiliar tasting water. A lot of horses have to get used to the idea that with water in front of you, you got to drink it. It always amazes me that some of these horses, they will stop and drink out of the most disgusting mud puddles. Like it's a milkshake, but you put this crystal clear brook in front of them and they kind of go, no, there's gators in there. It would be kind of an experience thing. Small buckets. Horses don't like small buckets. And even though we have domesticated them pretty well, and it still amazes me that these horses will allow us to do some of the things that we ask them to do, horses don't like head traps. They're still a prey animal. So if you're just giving them, this little 2-gallon bucket, or like these Home Depot buckets that, are tall and narrow, and you just hang that on the side of your trailer, that handle, that looks like a head trap to them. They're gonna maybe lean over and they're gonna kind of take a little sip off the top, but are they gonna put their head down all the way to the bottom and empty that bucket overnight? Very unlikely. Horses don't like when they have to drink water where their eyes have to go below the brim of the container. And so whatever it is, the water better not be more than about that far below the rim. So how do you do that? You give them a much, much bigger bucket. And even the 5-gallon flat back buckets, that's not enough. The best way to do it is to give them those great big 16-gallon open tubs, because you've got a good 3, 4, 5 gallons at the top before that eye has to go below the brim. A horse that can drink from his water without his eye going below the brim is going to consistently drink 10% more water than a horse where their eye has to go below the brim. It has to be a container that is not a head trap. So provide him with water that doesn't need a handle to hang it off the side of his the trailer. I totally get it. I have one of those horses that if you just took like a 5-gallon or tub or something, or a 5-gallon bucket and put it onto the ground, yeah, that's gonna get kicked over just like that. And then you're probably gonna pick up the bucket and hurl it at me. I seem to own horses like to throw things. But, big 16-gallon buckets, most horses are not gonna be able to tip those over as long as you keep them filled up to the brim. And a good trick that Jamie Kerr demonstrated at a clinic a couple years ago that I think is a great idea. When it's dry, take a Sharpie pen and then mark it on the inside of, okay, this is 5 gallons down, this is 10 gallons down, this is 15 gallons down. You shouldn't get to the point where you've done that, but measure it so that when you go to bed the night before and that tub should be filled up to the brim with water, and then you come out the next morning and you see where the level is, you go, great, he drank 4 gallons overnight for you to have. So good trick, little project to have at home. Fluid loss during the ride. Primarily it's going to be sweat. Horses can sweat up to a maximum of about 4 gallons per hour consistently throughout the day. The average loss during a 50-mile ride, and this is under ambient nice conditions. Nice conditions means low humidity, less than 20%, 60, 65 degrees, something like that, nice, non-technical trail. Those horses are gonna lose about 12 to 16 gallons. But remember, they're only gonna voluntarily replace about 2/3 of it. So that means they're only replacing maybe 8 to 11, so you've got a deficit. They're going to increase fluid loss during the ride. Hot, humid conditions. Sometimes it can be hot without being humid, it can be humid without being hot. If you start a ride along the coast and it's foggy, what's the humidity gonna be? Really high, right? It could be 60 degrees, and that humidity is high enough that that horse is still gonna have increased sweat losses because you don't have efficient evaporation going on. Difficult terrain. This is kind of a no-brainer. If you've got a bunch of hills that you're going up and down, if you've got sloppy footing that you've got to slog your way on through, anything like that, that's going to make more work. More work is more sweat. Excitement. Horses that are either just very, very competitive horses, horses that have race brain, young horses that are still going up and down instead of sending that energy down the trail. Poor pacing. This is your mistake. All of us have gone to rides where, especially a lot of times you'll see these at multi-day rides or something where you're just kind of like, do-do-do-do-do-do, here we are, you're just basically, clocking in your time clock and you're just getting on down the trail and, nice consistent, 7-8 miles an hour or whatever, and somebody just comes roaring on past you or something like that, and off they go. And then you're still like, do-do-do-do-do, here we are going along, and a couple of miles, all of a sudden you see them up on the horizon and then you pass them because now they're just walking. And a lot of the times that either the rider will see you coming and then they start going like one of this, if they've got a crop and they start whacking and the horse is going, I don't think so. Maybe when you pass, you're gonna vacuum and suck that other horse along for a little while. I tend to kind of speed up as I'm passing them because it's a fun game to psych them out a little bit. And also because I don't want them to keep up with me. I have a gaited horse. I want him focusing on his day, not on theirs. He tends to, start going, what's this behind me? And he's not concentrating, so I tend to ride alone. But just when you start doing that jackrabbing, fast, slow, fast, slow, fast, slow, you're not being efficient with your horse's energy, and you're not being efficient with either his onboard fuel, and you're not being efficient with his hydration levels. Obviously, horses that are either under condition for the pace that you're riding that day, or for whatever reason you're overexerting. We talked about this yesterday. Horses that are on a really high protein diet, a lot of alfalfa. This is not only because having to digest high protein produces more byproduct heat, but also because high protein, as that nitrogen breaks down, the first byproduct is going to be ammonia. Ammonia is toxic. The body wants to break that down even more and get rid of it as rapidly as possible. So that ammonia is going to be further broken down to urea. Urea as in urine. The kidneys go, that's urea. I know that's ammonia, that's toxic, I need to get rid of that. It will preferentially get rid of that urea, even though the rest of the body is going, hey, we got some hydration issues here, we need to conserve urine production. That's why horses that are on straight alfalfa pee so much. Because those kidneys are going, that's a toxic byproduct and I gotta get rid of it. Horses that are peeing more for something they're not getting an advantage from is inefficient use of your horse's body water. And lastly, age. This is just, I have another whole talk about maximizing longevity. This is something we need to be aware of as our horses age. Older horses will sweat less, but even when they're fully hydrated, they have less of a fluid capacity on board. They have an overall drier body, and so they have even less of that stretch factor to the rubber bands before they're potentially metabolically compromised. What he could do as a 6-year-old is not necessarily what he can do as a 16-year-old. Again, one of the major factors is going to be either an inability or unwillingness to adequately replace their fluid losses through voluntary. And this is going to be your primary factor for you to try and manage during the day. So again, when you start thinking, He hasn't started drinking yet, but that's okay. He'll drink all he needs once he gets thirsty enough. No, he probably won't. So you need to be managing this and managing it before this becomes an issue to the point where your horse is potentially in trouble. There's lots and lots of compartments in the body, but we can kind of just generally subcategorize them into what we call intracellular fluids. Those are the fluids, about 2/3 of it is inside the cells. That's about 53 gallons of fluid on board. It's not immediately available to horses. After an hour or so, yeah, some of it kind of shifts between the two, but about 2/3 of the water that is on board in a horse is not going to be immediately available for the water demands that he's got going on. Only about 1/3 of his body water, only about 26 gallons, is what they call extracellular fluids. And these are going to be the fluids that are outside or around the cells, and that includes specialized fluids like urine, plasma, which is the watery portion of blood, saliva, gastric juices, things like that. That is where, when the body needs more fluids for saliva, for sweat, for moving heat, things like that, that's the first place it's going to go. We're asking these horses to do, and these horses, possibly losing up to 4 gallons of fluid an hour, they only immediately have about 26 gallons to draw on. Now you add on like, okay, but I just had to travel in a hot trailer for the last 2 days. Maybe my horse didn't drink enough overnight. Maybe he's not drinking well this morning. See how close you can potentially be getting to that metabolic edge of a cliff when you just think, we're not doing a big deal, we're just going along, nice little working trot, heading on down the trail. Your horse could be closer to metabolic trouble than you might be expecting. Extracellular fluid also includes that extra fluid reservoir in the GI tract, specifically the hindgut. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. This is potentially another 8 to 10 gallons of fluids and also electrolytes for the horse to draw on. A double-edged sword. It counts as your emergency reserve fuel, but really relying on this is like when you look at, and now cars that are smarter than all of us put together, it start telling you here's what your range is before you run out of gas, and you're kind of going, okay, but I'm really don't want to stop and get gas because it's cold outside or it's raining or whatever. So you keep on going, you keep on going, you keep on going, and eventually your car starts saying, hey, stupid, you're about to run out of fuel. You want to pull over? All of us at one time or another, okay, I have pushed that until I can, but I've got another 3 miles of range. I'm good. Having to rely on that extra 8 to 10 gallons of fluid in the hindgut is like running your car's fuel tank down to that last 3 miles before you go, okay, fine, I'll stop and get fuel. It's a double-edged sword, because at least with your car, all that's going to happen is you're going to run out of gas. If you start pulling a lot of fluid out of the hindgut, what's happening to the poop that's left behind? It's getting more dehydrated, isn't it? What's the word for that? Impaction colic. Yes, absolutely. So you want to be very, very careful and don't rely on that, because this is your emergency reserve tank, but you really don't want to tap into that if you can possibly avoid it. So the first fluid to get tapped during dehydration is going to be plasma. This is the watery portion of blood. What happens to the rest of the blood as you're pulling away the water? Well, it's getting the fancy schmancy vet speak, means that we call it hemoconcentrated, but basically it's the difference between a glass of iced tea versus sucking milkshake through a straw. The pump, the heart, has to work a lot harder to push that through, because that blood is getting thicker and thicker. The point is the heart has to work that much harder to be pushing that blood around. If it's having to work that much harder, how are you going to be seeing that on the outside of the horse? Poor recoveries. You're going to be seeing hanging heart rates, failure to recover. These are horses that are at higher risk of getting metabolic pull if you can't pull within 30 minutes. And I was part of all of those debates, some of them at high volume during different committee meetings when AERC was debating about putting in this 30-minute rule. Because we have a lot of data that says that horses, regardless of how hard they have been exercising, no matter how extreme, if that horse is healthy and conditioned for the work, they should meet a reasonable pulse criteria within about 15 minutes, 20 minutes tops. Most of them should be able to meet it within 10 minutes. So it was really, 30 minutes was reasonable, but if your horse is not meeting criteria within 30 minutes, then there's a lot wrong with your horse. We need to be careful about this because a lot of the times we'll be conditioning at home for a certain way, and you actually do, you certainly need to condition at home for the conditions you're going to be riding with at a ride. But don't assume that because your horse is just romping through a conditioning ride at home, things aren't going to change, and he's still not working harder, because remember, you've got those trailering losses, he's camping out the night before, maybe he drank well, maybe he didn't, maybe he doesn't like the taste of that water, maybe he saw a buddy go past and now he wants to spend the night talking to his buddy at the other end of camp. You can always find that horse because they'll be camped right next to me. Don't count on your horse behaving the same at a ride that he does at home, even though, sometimes even, I live in Tevis country, so I condition on Tevis trails. You cannot take that exact same loop and go, okay, he should be behaving and performing exactly the same way during Tevis as he does when I go out and condition. Fluid inside the GI tract also counts as extracellular fluids. These are going to be things we were talking about the reservoir, the hind gut, also things like gastric juices, saliva, things like that. But again, remember that poop in the bowel, as it becomes drier, your chances of colic increase. This is where we're talking about that the body pays attention to dehydration way before we can see anything going on at a vet check. The very first thing that the body is going to do to start conserving fluid, it's going to start cutting down on saliva production, and it does that at less than 2% dehydration. So that's a horse that almost guaranteed, very, very few horses don't start a ride at least 2% dehydrated unless you literally, rode out, the starting line is out your back gate. This means a horse that is not producing as much saliva, you get to a vet check or someplace and you decided you want to feed him a little snacky along the way, you pull out, and because you didn't want to carry wet feed, you got some little dry pellets, you offer it to him. What if you increase the risk of during the ride? Choke. Your horse anything other than wet feed during the ride, because that horse is not producing as much saliva as he would at home. And never, ever, ever feed dry pellets at an endurance ride. As a matter of fact, my horses at home, even though I sometimes feed a pelleted feed, the concentrates or whatever, they always get it wet. Horses at home, and I get emails from people saying, my horse won't eat wet mash. Well, he's probably not going to die if he doesn't get it. So I offer to them wet, at least moist, so they start getting used to that idea. But then they have a chance and they just look at it and go, no, I'm not going to eat that, I want it dry. Okay, you get another opportunity tomorrow, friend, and it goes away, and I'm going to give it to a neighbor so he can watch. Because I got a whole bunch of other horses that are going, me, I want it. They will eventually learn to start eating a wet mash. And now John Henry, he's definitely, he realizes, and if not, then he's willing to educate you on the fact that he is in fact the center of the universe. And it's got a couple pounds of, concentrate in it, or there is a lot of water sitting on top of it. And so he's got this nice sloppy tasted little soup, and he wants his soup. So he drinks his soup and then goes over and eats wet hay for a while, and then he comes back and he eats the actual mash at the bottom. That's a really good habit for horses to have. So we already know that cellular function is adversely affected at less than 2%, but it's not only saliva production, it's also decreased sweat production, which means that his pathways to get rid of heat that he is producing are now going to be compromised. That means that we have an increased thermal load. Remember, we can't see 2% dehydration. Now, in humans, we know that 1% dehydration results in a 10% decrease in performance, just in general. 3% dehydration results in a 10% decrease in muscle strength and an 8% decrease in muscle speed. A really important thing if you have like reining horses, cutting horses, maybe hunter jumpers, things like that, where strength and speed is going to be much more of a big factor. Do we really care about that so much in endurance horses? Sure we do. Well, speed is going to be related to strength, but also speed, yes. Because a dehydrated horse is a tired horse. Tired horse is a klutzy horse. A klutzy horse is a horse that finds a rock with his name on it and comes in as a lame horse. Keep this in mind when we're out and we're riding trails like Cougar Rock, Pucker Point, these little itty bitty where you've got this gigantic 400-foot drop off on one side and you've got a trail in front of you about 18 inches wide. The Suicide Trail, Hills of Imminent Death, all of these fabulous names that ride managers that just, they kind of want to see you get a little pale sometimes. But that's something for you to keep in mind. These are not the trails where all of a sudden you want a horse starting to get tired and stumbly because he's tired, because he's dehydrated. When we're talking about thermal regulation, of all of those calories and all of the energy he's producing, about 65 to 70% of that is going to be released as heat. Down in the muscles, some of it by the visceral organs, without dissipation. And there's different pathways, but primarily most of it is going to be through the skin one way or another. Horses would reach lethal core temperatures in 15 minutes on the racetrack. These are horses that just traveling along like we do. This is if for some reason you were able to block every single heat pathway. So core temperature is going to increase by about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit per minute if you were able to still somehow contain that system. Then at the end of a 50-mile ride, that horse's core temperature would be 310 degrees Fahrenheit. Now you see why it's so important that we make sure that these horses are able to get rid of that heat. Primary heat loss is always going to be through evaporation of sweat, but again, regardless, it doesn't have to be hot to be humid. And if it's humid, evaporation is very inefficient. That's why a lot of the times at some of these coastal rides in the morning, you're riding around in the redwoods, it's foggy and things, these horses are steaming like crazy because they're still trying to get rid of heat, but evaporation is not available to them. So can you have horses that have a dangerously elevated rectal temperature, even though your air temperature outside is only 58, 60 degrees? Absolutely. See it, and they're just literally dripping wet because the body is still trying to go, okay, I'm still hot, I'm still going to keep on producing more and more sweat trying to get rid of it, and they can't. Sweat production starts to decrease at only 1 to 2% of dehydration. So this is the primary pathway of heat loss, but it starts to become compromised almost immediately, almost at the same time as that decreased and compromised saliva production. So we see people that they go, oh no, my horse is so fit, you never see him breaking a sweat. Right. No, you're just riding in some place where you've got enough of a temperature gradient and a humidity gradient that sweat is evaporating before it has a chance to build up and foam and start dripping. Be glad, because that means that your horse's thermoregulation is actually working. But horses, they call it anhydrosis, horses that have a variety of issues where they're unable to sweat adequately, those are horses that pretty much all need to live in Minnesota and never get ridden in daylight. When we're talking about exhausted horse syndrome, years ago when I first started vetting rides, we didn't have this term yet. But we just said, yeah, the horse is just, he's tired, he's exhausted, he's done for the day. Well, now we call it exhausted horse syndrome. And this is always going to be a variety of different physiologic pathways in the body that are compromised and not working well. Number one, and 100% of the time, dehydration is going to be the major factor. As a matter of fact, without dehydration, most of the time these other issues don't happen. So it's always going to be dehydration 100% of the time, electrolyte depletion to some degree or another about 95% of the time, overexertion or undercondition or some combination of the two, regardless of why that might be. Hyperthermia, again, hyperthermia is very often going to be because the horse is not able to get rid of all of that heat he is producing. And then colic and thumps, those are not, we can see those independently. Thumps is, at least in endurance rides, are always going to be secondary to these other issues. You can get thumps kind of experimentally other ways, but not in an endurance ride. Colic is going to be a sequelae, a result of all of these other things going on. We have horses that will come in and they're peeing coffee. Normal urine color should be yellow. It can be super light yellow, it can be a dark straw color, but it should never be any variation of red or brown. If it is, that is because the myoglobin, which is the pigment in skeletal muscle, is breaking down and getting dropped into blood circulation. It is toxic to the kidneys. So if your horse is peeing anything that looks like iced tea down to, I see it looking like black coffee, that horse's kidneys are taking a big hit. I don't care what else is going on that day. I don't care if he's otherwise eating, drinking, bright and perky. You need to stop everything and get that horse over the treatment vet if you like that horse and ever want to ride him again without blowing his kidneys sky high. These are horses that absolutely positively need aggressive fluid therapies. I've had riders come up to the treatment vet, either myself or another vet, and say, well, I suppose we ought to get, maybe 17, 20 liters dumped in. He's peeing coffee, but that's normal for him. But horses that come in and they're peeing, say, iced tea, you go, well, but he's eating and drinking, so I'm gonna give him an hour or so before we load up and trailer home for 8 hours. And then he looks a little better. Looks a little better is not, he's okay now, and it is not, I have not damaged my horse's kidneys. You see something that looks like iced tea or darker, that horse needs 20 liters of aggressive fluid therapy before you think about doing anything. And this is part where you start getting a little sciencey, but I promise this will all, it will come down to making sense, hopefully. How does the body even recognize that your body is getting dehydrated? Well, the brain has receptors for both osmolarity and tonicity. Those are just fancy schmancy words for how dilute is the blood and how salty is the blood. It is going to notice either the blood is getting a higher concentration of salt and go, okay, we need some more water to dilute that out, because too high a salt, that can be a problem, that can cause its own issues. So we're going to kick in those thirst pathways to get some more water into the system. Or the body will also notice if the blood pressure starts dropping. And then it's going to respond by doing several things. It's going to decrease sweat and saliva production. It's going to decrease urine output. It's going to start squeezing down the vascular system to increase the blood pressure. That's not such a great thing, because as you're squeezing down those vessels, it means that less blood and oxygen is being transported to the working muscles and to the organ systems. And it also means that less byproducts, including heat, are being transported away from those muscles. So this is not good news. The blood supply away from the less vital organs. Most of you were here yesterday, so you know that there's a pecking order. That this prey animal has now gone into fight or flight emergency mode. It's going to make sure that most of the blood and most of the resources are going to go first to the brain, the heart, and the lungs. Then second tier is going to the skeletal muscles, because it thinks you're trying to get away from lions and tigers, and so it's going to make sure that you can keep getting away from them. And it's going to keep redistributing. And at the very, very bottom of the pecking order is the GI tract. This is why we start getting bad gut motility when you come into vet checks. And the number one reason why we get that is going to be overexertion. But overexertion is going to be proportional to that horse's level of dehydration. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. The body is also going to go, oh, you know what? You should also take a drink. It does that after it's done all of this other stuff. So thirst is less sensitive in horses, and it's very slow compared to human athletes. This is about the only thing that human athletes do better than a horse athlete. This response is going to start to be stimulated at about 1 to 2% dehydration, but because the thirst response is much less sensitive and because it's slow, that actual thirst in a horse may be delayed for hours. Now that doesn't matter so much if you've got a horse that's just standing around in a pasture and as soon as he's ready for it, there's a 300-gallon tank of water for him to mosey over and get some. But our horses get a lot of work done in a couple of hours, which is why it's very, very common for horses not to be thirsty and take a good drink until you're 20, 25 miles into a ride. The thirst response is slow in horses. At maximum sweat rates, horses can become significantly dehydrated before they get around to taking a drink. And again, remember, I'm going to keep on pounding this into you all weekend long. Horses are only going to voluntarily replace about 2/3 of their fluid losses. So by the time that horse gets around to voluntarily drinking, if you haven't done anything else to try and trick that thirst response a little bit, by the time he gets around to it, you're kind of a day late and a dollar short. And you're already kind of starting to write checks that your horse's body can't quite cash. You may get away with it, but it's not ideal. So horses don't get as thirsty as fast as humans do. Part of the reason why is because human sweat is different from horse sweat. Human sweat is more watery than human blood is. So human sweat is mostly water. In general, humans, you're not going to see a salty crust on them like we see it all the time on horses, and that's because human sweat is much more watery. As humans are sweating, most of the salt is being left behind in blood circulation. So that brain receptor that is going, how salty is this blood? It's noticing that, hey, this blood is getting a lot more salty. I'm going to make my human thirsty. Humans tend to start drinking earlier because they have that receptor that says, hey, this blood is getting salty. Horse sweat has about the same saltiness as horse blood. So regardless of how much they are sweating until they've completely run out of salt, the blood is going to stay as salty as it was when the horse was completely hydrated. That receptor, they have the receptor that notices how salty the blood is, but when that horse is just sweating through regular exercise, is it going to stimulate that thirst response based on the saltiness of the blood? No, because that blood is not getting saltier or more concentrated in salt as the horse sweats. The only receptor that becomes a factor here is a drop in blood pressure. So remember all of those other things that the body was doing, including the vasoconstriction, changing blood pressure and doing all that other stuff, those veins have to be constricting down for the body to go, hey, this blood pressure is dropping. I should do something about that. So we're going to do everything else about urine and sweat production, saliva production, urine, all of that other stuff. And then eventually it gets around to going, hey, let's make them thirsty too. You've got all of this other stuff going on. So it is really important, and we have a lot of research in human athletes that would try and extrapolate to horses, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But this is one that is really important to understand that horses and humans are different, is that the thirst response in horses is much less sensitive and much, much slower. And you can't look at it and kind of go, well, when the salt gets high enough in his blood, then he'll start getting thirsty. That is true, but it's not happening just through normal sweat production. The water stops, and your horse is not tanking up. It is a mistake to think he is not thirsty and doesn't need water. It is much more likely that those baroreceptors have not told him, hey, you're thirsty, you need to start drinking. It's a common practice. Some people will say, well, I'm going to encourage him to drink, but I'm going to take a syringe and I'm going to just squirt a syringe of water into his mouth. You're actually shooting yourself in the foot doing that. This is kind of one of those counterintuitive things, where sometimes people, if they have a helmet that can hold water, they'll hold up a plastic baggie and they'll like dip their nose and splash it in their mouth or something like that. You're actually shutting down that thirst response. This is again one of those fight or flight syndromes that if the body figures, we're running like this for this long because there's something really hungry trying to chase us down. So, okay, you're thirsty, you can stop and have a drink, but I don't want you tanking up, completely rehydrating yourself because, those tigers are getting closer. So pretty much there are neuroreceptors in the esophagus that as soon as pure water hits them, they start to shut down that thirst response. And some of those receptors are actually in the mouth itself. So by squirting water, fresh water, into a horse's mouth when you want him to be drinking, you're not encouraging to drink, you're telling that body, nah, you're fine, you don't need to drink at all. He just got to drink. Do not squirt water in their mouth. Let him go thirsty, let him go dry. Let the body do its job. Now, can you trick the thirst response? Yes, you can. Hal Schott is at Michigan State. He's pretty much the king of electrolyte research, including in endurance horses. This was a terrific study. They put together a 36-mile course, and this was back east. It was all invited riders, so they kind of pick and choose. They wanted horses that were experienced riders, ones that would do okay, this is, a ride, this is exactly what we're supposed to be doing. We want you to ride at such and such a pace. Everybody was on the same course. It was the same conditions. They picked a day that was warm, but not brutally hot, that was humid, but not brutally humid. And they divided the horses into two groups. Half of them were syringed electrolytes at certain places throughout the ride, and the other half were not. And the electrolytes that they were syringing, if you were asking, it's the old PNER product, Summer Games. Oh. The new name for that, the formulation is very, very close, is now Enduramax. But they worked out, and a lot of math was involved based on the horses, on their weight and different things like that, and hydrated. So it wasn't like all of these, that horse had only traveled a half hour, and that horse had traveled 3 days. All of these horses started at the same hydration level. And the amount of electrolytes, the aim was to try and replace 50% of their estimated electrolyte losses, which is actually really aggressive. And we're going to talk about why you don't want to try necessarily to replace that much of it. But replacing 50% of the estimated losses is really aggressive. It turns out that of the horses that were not electrolyted, that those horses over 36 miles lost 3.2% of their body weight, and they voluntarily drank, on average, 4.2 gallons. And it was actually a pretty narrow range. It was interesting that there was not like one horse only drank a gallon and another horse drank 6 gallons. If they were not electrolyted, they drank on average about 4.2 gallons. And that worked out to, they only replaced about half of their fluid losses. They had a weight scale and they were weighing the horses all throughout. The horses that were electrolyted, those horses drank 7.6 gallons on average. 3.5 gallons more than the horses that were not electrolyted. And they voluntarily replaced almost all of their fluid losses. Now this is interesting because we have other data that says horses will only voluntarily replace 2/3. Well, it turns out that 2/3 is kind of the average when you factor in whether some horses are being electrolyted versus some horses that aren't. If those horses are getting their lost electrolytes replaced, whether they like it or not, those horses will drink significantly more, not quite, but pretty close to twice as much water. And those horses, pretty close to replacing all of their fluid losses. I think we've been able to replicate this again at 100-mile rides or things like that, because just the logistics of just managing this was pretty difficult. The statistics on this were just bulletproof. It was an absolutely gorgeous study. So conclusion, can you trick the thirst response? You bet you can. And you can absolutely start these horses drinking earlier in the day and drinking better by getting electrolytes into them. However, electrolytes are a double-edged sword. Electrolytes are not innocuous. Now, if you want to start a food fight at conventions and talks and things like that start talking about electrolyte in horses during a ride. And they will say, I don't electrolyte my horses at all. My horse does just fine. These horses, I do this, I do that. Electrolytes are poison. Overdose of anything. In toxicology, they always teach you that the most important thing is dose. So, can you poison your horse with too much electrolytes? You bet you can. You can kill a horse with too much electrolytes. But try living your life without any electrolytes. You're going to be really, really sick really, really soon, and you're going to be non-functional, and you're eventually also going to die without electrolytes. So toxicology is a qualitative thing based on the dose of how much you're getting. But it doesn't mean that you can just be willy-nilly jamming electrolytes into these horses. There has to be some math involved. You go too aggressive, you're going to have horses who are going to shut down because their belly hurts. You can get hypernatremia, which is too much salt, hypochloremia, hyper, too much chlorine or chloride in the system. There's all kinds of issues that go along with that, but they're bad. So trying to replace 50% of their electrolyte losses is pretty aggressive. Replace maybe about a third of their estimated electrolyte losses. Sometimes in some horses you can go up higher than that, but boy, that better be a horse that you got access to one of those handheld iStats and you're just doing all kinds of blood work during conditioning rides and things like that. I did that with my horse John Henry. I own one of the little handheld things, and I had a training loop, and man, I just back and forth, just constantly, because he is a horse. He's a bigger horse. He's heavily built. He sweats like crazy, and he's a horse that chows down through electrolytes like you wouldn't believe. So his best amount of electrolytes is more than a third, a little bit less than 50%. But I'm putting in amounts of electrolytes into him during a hot ride like Tevis that would make another horse that comes in with him that's an 800-pound Arab that is built like a radiator, would make that horse really sick. What that rider over there is doing. You ride your own ride and you work out what works for your horse based on these guidelines. This is why I like to explain physiology. I don't like cookbook, and I don't like saying you put this much into it. They cover about a third of their estimated electrolyte losses. So you're all sitting here going, okay, and how much is that?
Right.
In cool weather, ridden moderately, assuming, say, most of the time you're going to be just nice little working trot down the trail, and you're not bombing along at a hand gallop all day long. Their loss is going to be about 2 ounces of salt per hour of exercise. Now that's loss. That's not what you're trying to replace. That's loss. They may lose up to 4 ounces of salt in extreme conditions. When it's really hot, when they're working really hard, things like at Tevis conditions, if it's really humid, things like that. So that means that to replace a third of that, you want to try and estimate about, 1/3 to 1/2 would be between 0.6 ounces to 1 ounce of electrolytes per hour of exercise. During an average 50-mile ride, that means that you are going to try and get somewhere between 5.5 to 8 ounces of electrolytes into them, divided up throughout the ride. You're certainly not going to do that just in one.
That's dry.
Dry, yeah, that's before you add in applesauce or molasses or buffers or anything else like that, just the actual electrolyte itself. So how much salt is that? I like Enduramax. It is a formulation that is actually backed by statistics and actual physiology. It's not something where they just kind of threw something together in a bathtub. So if you're using Enduramax, then that's going to be about 2 ounces the night before. Not because your horse is necessarily depleted in electrolytes the night before a ride, but because you want to be stimulating that thirst response by increasing their plasma salt content a little bit. So you're going to repeat 2 ounces of it in the morning before the start, 2 ounces at every vet check, and
maybe an additional 1 to 2 ounces in between checks. And this is going to be really variable. This is something that a couple of years ago, another veterinarian was telling me about a ride that he was vetting, and there was a horse that had come, and this was an incredibly talented athletic horse that a year or two before had come in top 5 at Tevis. Well, Tevis is a really tough ride. It's a really long ride. It's a really hot ride. And horses need to burn through a lot of electrolytes at Tevis, especially if you're top 5. So they had really electrolyted this horse very consistently and gave that horse a lot. I think that horse got about 16 ounces of dry weight Enduramax throughout the ride, maybe even a little bit more. And the horse did fabulous. He didn't win Hagen Cup, but he came pretty darn close. The horse just looked amazing. Later on in the season, or early the next following season, as a favor, there was some family friend that they were kind of interested in seeing what endurance was about. They brought their junior rider, and they went to one of the Ridgecrest rides. Anybody ever been to one of those? So, it's really cool weather. It's flat desert. There's not a bunch of hills that or certainly not mountains like you're climbing at Tevis. It's usually cool, sometimes even windy weather. And they just entered in the limited distance. So 25 miles, they were not blazing along, they were just trotting along, riding with their sponsor, but they continued to electrolyte the horse at the same rate as they had at Tevis. This horse comes along who is in world-class condition. He comes across the finish line, he stops, his eyes are real big and glazed, and all of a sudden he just stops, he staggers, and drops to the ground.
Wow.
And they had to work on this horse pretty hard because he had cardiac arrhythmias from so much potassium that horse's heart was just doing backflips trying to catch up with it. And the kidneys were trying to get rid of it, but it just couldn't be gotten rid of fast enough. Potentially see things like cardiac arrhythmias. So again, this is an argument for you don't have just a set protocol for every ride, every horse. You have to say, okay, fine, that was Tevis, and that's how much I gave at Tevis because we were doing this, but now I'm only doing this, and the conditions are different, and our goals are different, and how hard the horse is going is entirely different. Dial it back. There is such a thing as too much electrolyting. So that's the Enduramax recommendations. Performance Wind, which they've actually pulled off the market for right now, but it will eventually be coming back in some form. The nice thing about Performance Wind is that it dissolves really easily in a bucket of water, and horses tend to like it, mostly because it's really high in sugar. But you can also syringe Performance Wind, but just keep in mind that a lot of it is sugar. So that's why you have to give 3 times as much Performance Wind to equal 1 ounce of Enduramax. Now you do need a little bit of glucose in the system for electrolytes to be absorbed. There's like this little rotating door, sort of a gate in the walls of the small intestine, and it kind of trades places with some glucose, and you need the glucose, but you don't need 50% of it. You don't need tons, and it doesn't have to be coming from the electrolytes. It can be coming from, a handful of grass that he ate, or hay that's he ate that has some starch in it, or anything else, a handful of sweet feed, almost anything else. But that would be 3 ounces of Performance Wind per hour of work. Man, that's a lot of that stuff. You're going to go through a bucket of that in pretty short order. But horses do tend to like it because it's really high in sugar. So if you're giving your horse how much salt all of that, you can be either just dosing at the checks versus every hour on the trail. A lot of this is also going to depend on, can you get efficient at electrolyting your horse? Some horses you can kind of get them to the point where you can electrolyte them from a syringe while you're still in the saddle. Usually, if horses will voluntarily let you do that, you're probably not getting enough electrolytes into them. So people will say things like, oh yeah, my horse will turn around and slurp the electrolytes right out of the syringe. No, what he's slurping out of there is probably sugar water, that there might be just the tiniest little touch of electrolytes to them, but if your electrolyte, whatever it is that you're syringing, if it actually tastes good, you're not getting an effective amount of electrolytes into them. Smaller doses does tend to work better, especially on horses that if they shut down after you syringe them, then you need to be making your doses smaller. You need to be adding more of a buffer or some kind of a flavoring agent like molasses or pancake syrup or something like that, usually more buffer. Because if you drop that much salt into their stomach that they're completely shutting down and they won't eat, they won't drink, they won't do anything, and they're even acting colicky, too much salt hurts. You can run your own little wonder rat research at home by eating a tablespoon of salt. Do it on an empty stomach. That makes it even more exciting. Again, horses can't barf. They do not have the receptors and the muscles for them to be able to throw up like other species can. But they can still feel nauseated. They can still want to feel like they want to throw up. But, so if your horse completely shuts down, then you need to change your protocol. And usually that's going to mean smaller doses, more frequent doses. Your horse may still need 6 to 8 ounces during a 50-mile ride, but you're certainly not going to try and get it into him in adjusted vet checks. You may have to figure out a way that you're getting it into him every hour on the trail, or every hour and a half, or whenever you stop at water checks, or sneak a little bit into his feed or whatever. So again, this is going to be, don't pay attention to what those hot shoes over there, they're going to the world championships. Don't pay attention to what they're doing. First of all, they're working at a different level than you are, and because I've worked with a whole bunch of them, they lie. I get it, some horses are a whole lot easier to get on and off than others. This is one of my Anglo-Arab mares. She did endurance, and let me tell you, this is one high-octane girl. And she's a big girl. She doesn't look quite that big because I'm fairly tall myself, but she's about 16'1". And when she's going boing, 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 she can be kind of a challenge to get on and off sometimes. So she is one of those that I have just gotten to the point where I can syringe her from the saddle, but boy, I'll tell you, that was a project to get to that point. Should we try and replace all of the salt deficit without hurting your horse? First of all, we don't know what the maximum absorption of sodium chloride is in the small intestines. We just don't have that research yet. Salt can very easily aggravate the lining. That's why horses start acting colicky and uncomfortable, and they start turning around and looking, and they start kicking at their belly. Those are horses that are not appreciating having a great big glob of salt dropped on top of it. Now, salt is not going to cause gastric ulcers, but if your horse already has gastric ulcers, it's certainly going to irritate them. And again, I know this from firsthand experience. A couple of years ago, I had a particular infection it gave me, I had ulcers in my esophagus, my stomach, and my small intestine. And I made the mistake once of eating something. I was supposed to be on a bland diet for a month, and I was so bored with it. I ate something that was really salty, and it hit the stomach, and holy cow, did those ulcers let me know about it. Horses may not have clinically grade 2, grade 3 gastric ulcers, but horses will start to develop the earliest form of gastritis, which is kind of the pre-form of gastric ulcers, if they haven't eaten for as little as 8 to 12 hours. Horses travel all the time. There's lots and lots of horses that may not eat, so he may have just developed those earlier stages of gastritis. So again, be really careful about dumping big loads of salt right on top of that. You want to add a buffer. You want to make sure he's already got food in the stomach, and you don't want to be doing great big single doses. You want lots of little doses. And the analogy I used yesterday, if you came into a vet check and your crew comes up and says, you need to replace some salt, here, eat this spoonful of salt. Is that going to sit well? Absolutely not. But if somebody says, there's your chair over there, there's your lunch laid out, and here's a bag of potato chips, I'm on it. I chips at endurance rides. Pretty much, my crew, and they felt so bad about it. Years later, she's still apologizing. Keep like, no, it's fine. Remember, I got the buckle. Everything's good. We're fine. But they had gone out and gotten exactly the sandwich that I had asked for at each of the checks and left it in the refrigerator. And they didn't realize it until they got to Robinson's, and they're kind of like, we don't have a sandwich. But they had potato chips and watermelon. I was good. And of course, then when they hear that there's a rider, then there's all kinds of food coming in. So I mean, I was very well fed, but pretty much, I could get through rides just fine with watermelon and potato chips, because humans also develop that appetite for salt. Too much salt at one time is also going to pull excess water from that extracellular fluid, which again is going to be the watery portion of blood, from there into the inside of the GI tract. And it's transient, but you want to keep as much water as possible in the blood circulation. When you put too much and you push it too hard, you can start getting too high potassium, and you can start potentially cause your horse arrhythmias. Now, he's not necessarily going to fall over right there on the trail, but still, is that a time when you want that heart not operating at its most efficiently? Absolutely not. So if you are pushing, really aggressive amounts, it's possible you might get away with it, but it's not ideal. So just keep that in mind. Always think that electrolytes are going to be an ounce of prevention, not a pound of cure. If you don't electrolyte your horse starting early in the day and doing it consistently, and then all of a sudden you get to lunch check or vet check 3, and now your horse is not recovering. Now his hydration is bad. Now his gut sounds are bad. Now he's got that real glazed look where he's not looking outside, he's looking inside. And you kind of go, that horse could probably use some electrolytes. It's through IV fluids. You have lost your window of opportunity, and more than likely dumping more fluids into that horse's stomach. All you're going to be doing is drawing more fluids from the plasma into the GI tract. It's not going to get absorbed enough, and that is a horse. I have seen those horses literally go from, I feel really bad, but I'm standing here, to literally on the ground. Don't do that. More ways to encourage their drinking. Horse doesn't like to drink while he's trailering. You can e-light that horse, syringe him right before you load up. You're going to get more salt into his system. You're going to hopefully trigger it so that after you've trailered for a couple of hours, if you stop for some little walkies and take a little break, offer him some water, maybe now he's a little more willing to have a little drink. If you do put hay in the trailer, make it wet hay. Same thing that you want it. You really don't want to have dry hay in the trailer. A couple of reasons for that. One is, remember that he's going to become 1% dehydrated for every hour and a half of travel. So if you go long ways, a horse that is 5% dehydrated towards the end of that trip, he's at that saliva production has been compromised from obstruction. Also, because if you have a trailer that is not long enough for that horse, he will lower his head, stretch his neck out, and cough, then that horse is also going to have a harder time getting rid of anything that's kind of stuck back in his larynx that he can't get rid of. So I'm not a fan of having just plain hay inside the trailer. If you do have hay in the trailer, it should be wet hay. That also means that in between rides, you can't leave that wet, stinky, or frankly, even between trips to and from base camp, you got to completely clean that out, because that stuff will start getting moldy in a hurry. And that is not only very, very bad for your horse to eat, but any of that dry aerosolized mold is incredibly irritating to the respiratory system. So that's why you have to be really careful and really stay on top of that. And what this has worked out really well for John Henry, I've been doing this with him for about 12 years now, is that I get one of those like 8-gallon tubs, the ones that have like the metal rings around the rim, and you can wire or chain those into place inside your trailer. And then he doesn't get a mash for like maybe 2 days before we're leaving for a ride. And he gets really noisy. It's a good thing I don't have close neighbors, because he is going to be screaming about how he's being abused, and he's about to faint away if he doesn't get his mash. But I make a big deal about when I'm loading up the trailer, that I'll take, you know, the 8-gallon tub, and I'm very noisy about to put a couple pounds of his favorite mash in there, and it's guaranteed, he's right there at the fence, you know, going, making all the noises. And then that gets wired into place in the front of his stall. And then I add a couple gallons of water to that. So it soaks up, it's got that thick layer of soup on top of it, and that's what he gets to eat during the ride. Now I get it, that it's gonna splash around if you don't do something about that. But what you can do is take a piece of 2x4 that has been cut to the size, you put that down, you push it down on top of it, and it acts as a baffle to help stop with a slopper. And most of the time, at least him, you know, he's gone through and he's eaten quite a bit of that, and he's slurped off a lot of that fluid. So when we were talking about feeding a horse that high glycemic meal the day before, that's pretty much where his is coming from. Most of the time, he's cleaned it up and all of that extra water by the time that we get there. Now, if we stop somewhere along the way, I may add another couple of handfuls and I add some more water to it, he works on that. And I may even sneak in a little pinch of electrolytes as well. But he also gets electrolyted before he gets in the trailer. So he's got the fluid in front of him. So is it a gigantic amount? Is it going to totally offset that 6 gallons of fluid that he's lost if we have an 8-hour drive? No. But that's an extra 2 to 3 gallons that I don't have to worry about, and I'll take all I can get. Here's a trick that this was really cool research project. When they come in after exercise, and this can be after a loop, if you are lucky enough to have a crew waiting for you at rides, you know, certainly something at, you know, like Tevis or, you know, big long rides like that, first, before you take them over to the regular water trough. Or electrolyte them with a little bit of water, electrolyte them with a dose of electrolytes, maybe just a couple miles down the trail when you know we're coming into a vet check. Horses that have, when their first drink of water is something that is slightly salty, those horses are going to drink more fresh water in the following hour than they will if their first drink of water is fresh water. And a lot of horses, and you'll see this at FEI rides, you know, where they've got a bazillion of these little grooms that are all, you know, hurled themselves on these horses coming in. And no, I am not a fan of UAE or, you know, any of the certain practices that are done, but you certainly can't fault them for not having enough people crewing on the horse. They have one little designated guy, and his only job is as soon as that horse comes in, he's holding exactly the same bucket that's a different color from all of the other buckets. And he's offering it to that horse, and that horse comes in and goes, that's my bucket, that's my person. And he goes over it and he drinks that water, and that horse is going to drink more water in the following hour than the horse that comes in and is offered fresh water. In the mouth, on the tongue, and down the esophagus, that otherwise is kind of shutting down that thirst response. So this takes a lot of practice. But try and see if you can get your horse so that when you come in, usually start at home with doing a conditioning ride, that even if you're riding out of your own home gate, when you come back in, already have, you know, a bucket of slightly salty water set up for him. And come in, and that's your water. And if he wants water, there it is. If he goes, I don't want that, I want fresh water. Okay, well, why don't you just stand there for a while? If he thinks about it for a half hour, 45 minutes, and he still hasn't had anything to drink, maybe it's time for you, and you shouldn't have untapped him at this point, maybe it's time for you to get back in the saddle and go out for another loop. One of the craftiest, we've lost her now, we lost her to cancer a couple of years ago, but one of the Pacific Southwest riders, that's how she pretty much, all of her rides, she would take a horse out, she would do a conditioning ride, and she'd come on back. And if that horse didn't jump into the water that she had set out, and if it didn't immediately start looking for food and for hay and things like that, you must not be tired yet. Let's go out again, day long, until that horse learned. But if I want to be able to go home and actually rest, I better drink the damn water and start eating my hay. But I'll tell you, when she went to rides, she come in and that horse was looking for his bucket of water. He was looking for his food, and her horses had a great appetite. So, again, that's something that, see, you can kind of work on that. You absolutely have to do this at home, not just at rides. Have a bucket ready after the conditioning ride, and you might want to go out for a conditioning ride, and even if you have natural water out on the trail, maybe don't let them drink. Bring home a thirsty horse. Now, if you're trying to get a horse to drink natural water, you're going to do this the other way around. You're going to go out with a thirsty horse and then only offer him natural water. And if you come back and he's going, no, I want, my fresh water over here, but I didn't want that nice clean river water, then it's time to get back in and go back over to the river until he decides river water tastes just fine. And there's, I don't remember when it was, but it was sometime in the last 6 months to a year or so, something like that. I actually wrote an article that's in Endurance News. The title of it is, I think, Does Your Horse Have a Drinking Problem? When you're doing something like that, a lot of the times horses aren't going to accept it when you just put in the full amount. But ideally, what you eventually want to be able to work up to is the equivalent of Enduramax, 2 tablespoons per gallon of water. If you still have a bucket of Performance weight around, and you're basically going to take practically the whole tub and dump it in there, but you need about 4.5 ounces per gallon of water, which is about a half a cup or so. A lot of riders still like Aculites, so that would be about 2.5 ounces per gallon. But don't start out at that amount. Start out with just a tiny, tiny, tiny amount, and then just work your way up, work your way up, work your way up. What if you don't want to syringe your horse? Some people just don't. For a variety of reasons, it's okay by me. Then you need to try and get salt into the horse every other way you can. And just think of this as using a salt shaker on everything. Now, I've got this weird metabolic thing that I normally have to eat a lot of salt. I add salt to virtually everything I eat. If I don't, I start to fade out, and sometimes I've actually done it when I'm up trying to talk, and all of a sudden I go, I need to sit down right now here on the floor. That's not a good way to maintain your dignity. Not that I have much. But just basically sprinkle salt onto virtually everything. Onto his wet hay, a little bit into his water, giving him electrolyte cookies. Sometimes that works, sometimes not so much. Into his mash, start slowly and increase it. Now, even though salt is always going to be added to commercial feeds, in general, the rule is that livestock, including horses, will refuse food that is higher than 1% in salt. So that's not a lot of sodium at all. And after that, they go, nope, just too salty. But what you can do is, again, you start small and just gradually work them up, gradually work them up. With John Henry, I wanted him to be eating really salty mashes. So I started out very small, and then I just keep on adding up a little bit, till he finally would look at the mash and he'd taste it and go, no, too salty. Okay, so the next mash is, I would be able to back it down until he was willing to accept that. I got to the point where his mashes at Tevis and the mash that I was hand feeding him out of baggies in between checks was really salty. I mean, if you tasted it, you could taste the salt to it. Same thing with me, as a matter of fact, because I have to eat a lot of salt in my diet to keep my blood pressure up. My husband doesn't add salt to anything. But that actually works out okay because he never steals food off of my plate. To him, my food is inedible. But to me, it tastes fine because I'm used to it. You can use that same sort of protocol and use that with your horse to get them over time used to eating that sloppy mash that has some extra salt in it. Again, offer the better bucket. Offer tubs, not buckets. That applies not only to water buckets, but also to feed buckets. Your horse is going to eat and drink out of wide, flat tubs or pans than they are out of those little narrow buckets. Your eyes don't have to go below the brim. Make sure they're clean. It is amazing how many times I've seen people that just pull out a bucket that has a bunch of dried poop because they use that for cleaning out the back of the trailer, and then they go ahead and they just fill it up with water and go, he's gonna be fine. You know, I saw him poop into his bucket once, and it's kind of, okay, but it's not ideal, and I get it, that yes, sometimes these horses will drink out of mud puddles, usually because they're looking for salt, but still, put it into a clean bucket. No head traps, be careful of those handles, and you wouldn't think that you have to actually say this, but he should be able to actually reach his water. I have seen horses, especially ones that are on overhead ties, that, you know, they put out a tub of water and it's all filled to the brim, but, you know, they kind of put it maybe a little bit farther out so the horse isn't not pawing at it and trying to knock it over and things like that. And he can get to it when the water's right up to the brim, but if the water drops down like this, now all of a sudden he can't reach it. So make sure your horse can actually reach the water. It tends to be a lot more efficient that way. Remember that most of the fluid is going to be lost during the first 20 to 25 miles of a ride. So when you're trying to teach your horse things, then remember, when you're even going out for conditioning rides, if you're trying to teach him to come back and drink soup out of a salty bucket, if you're trying to get him to drink that bucket of salty water, have you taken him out for a long enough ride to actually make him thirsty? If you're only going out and doing a little 10-15 mile spin, and he comes back and he hasn't had anything to drink out on the trail at all, but he comes back and it kind of goes, okay, fine, yeah, oh look, there's my regular tank, I'm gonna go drink out of that. It's because you didn't make him all that thirsty. So keep that in mind during conditioning rides. If you need your horse to learn to drink natural water better, or drink maybe the slightly salty water that you want to train him to drink, you need to be bringing home a thirsty horse. I mean, use some common sense for it here. You're not going to train your horse eight hours to go to this fabulous trailhead that you heard about, and you're not offering any water, and then you're going to syringe him with the electrolyte salt, and then get on him and then go out and go do 30 miles and then wonder why he's not performing that well. And you know, use some common sense here, but still, you need to think about producing a thirsty horse when you're doing conditioning, because that's where not just the conditioning is going on, but educating their brain. So you need not just conditioning, you need training. Thank you very much.